Here's a question that might surprise you. What if we've been asking the wrong questions about Bigfoot all along? For decades, the debate has centered on whether these creatures exist, whether that blurry photograph is real, whether those footprints are authentic. But what if the real mystery isn't proving existence? What if it's understanding what the accumulated evidence actually tells us? Because here's the thing. The evidence isn't scarce, it's overwhelming. Over 10,000 documented sightings in North America alone. More than 1,500 plaster casts of footprints, thermal imaging footage, audio recordings analyzed by military cryptolinguists, body impressions that primatologists can't explain, hair samples that don't match any known species. And that's just the evidence we know about. Today, we're going to examine all of it. The footprints with dermal ridges that fingerprint experts say can't be faked. The thermal footage showing figures that move in ways no human can replicate. The international sightings from Indonesia to the Himalayas. The Native American traditions stretching back centuries. And yes, the claims from credible sources that much more evidence exists, but has been deliberately hidden from public view. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to show you what's been documented, what's been analyzed, and what questions remain unanswered. By the end, you'll have seen evidence that many people never encounter. Whether that evidence convinces you or leaves you skeptical is entirely up to you. But one thing's certain, this mystery runs deeper than most people realize. Let's dive in. Eyewitness testimony forms the backbone of Bigfoot evidence. As of today, researchers have documented over 10,000 sightings across North America, with the highest concentrations occurring in the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachian Mountains, and the Great Lakes region. But here's what makes these reports compelling. They're not all coming from weekend campers or attention-seeking YouTubers. They're coming from people with everything to lose and nothing to gain. Let me give you a recent example that caught researchers' attention. October 4th, 2024. Interstate 80 in Center County, Pennsylvania. Around 5:30 in the evening, just before sunset. A retired civil engineer and Air Force veteran is driving eastbound, following another vehicle at a distance of about 150 yards. Nothing unusual, just another commute. Then he sees something step onto the highway ahead of the car in front of him. A dark figure. Massive. Human shape, but distinctly not human. The witness told investigators from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization that his first thought was genuine fear for the person in the car ahead. He actually said out loud, "What the hell's he doing? He's going to get hit." But what happened next is what shook him. The figure crossed all 4 lanes of Interstate 80 in approximately 3 seconds. Not running in the panicked way a human would run across a highway. Moving with what he described as a smooth, almost gliding motion. And when it reached the far side, it didn't climb over the guardrail the way any human or bear would need to. It simply cleared it effortlessly and vanished into the woods. The BFRO investigator who interviewed this witness, Benjamin C., wrote in his official report that he found the man to be sincere and very credible. But here's what makes this sighting even more interesting. This witness wasn't alone. 2 other people filed reports about seeing something unusual in that exact area on the same day. One of them, a hunter with more than 50 years of experience in the woods, submitted his own account. His statement was direct. "I just want to add, I know what I saw, but don't know what I saw. I'm an avid hunter with 50 plus years in the woods. This was not a bear." Think about that for a moment. A man who spent half a century hunting, who knows every animal in Pennsylvania's forests, who understands how bears move and what they look like from every angle, is telling you with absolute certainty that what he saw was not a bear. What does that mean? This pattern repeats constantly in Bigfoot research. The witnesses who tend to be most credible are often the most reluctant to come forward. Filmmaker and researcher Alex Petikoff, who works with small-town monsters, has said this repeatedly. A lot of the most credible people are people that have no motivation behind the story. Sometimes it's hard to even get them to tell you the story. These are people who understand the social cost of reporting a Bigfoot sighting. They know they'll be mocked. They know friends and family might question their mental stability. Law enforcement officers risk their careers. Park rangers face disciplinary action. Scientists jeopardize their professional reputations. So why do they come forward? Because they saw something they can't explain, and they believe someone needs to know about it. The consistency across these reports is striking. Witnesses from completely different backgrounds, different time periods, different geographic regions, all describing similar characteristics. Height estimates between 7 and 10 feet. Massive build with broad shoulders, covered in dark hair, bipedal movement that's distinctly different from how bears or humans walk. And almost universally, witnesses describe an overwhelming sense of intelligence when they make eye contact with these creatures. They're not looking at an animal. They're looking at something that's looking back at them with awareness. Could all of these people be lying? Statistically, sure. Any individual report could be a fabrication. But when you're dealing with thousands of independent witnesses across decades, many of whom actively didn't want to report what they saw, dismissing every single account becomes harder to justify than accepting that at least some of them might be describing something real. Consider the geographic distribution of these sightings. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization maintains a comprehensive database of reports, and when you map them out, patterns emerge. The Pacific Northwest has the highest concentration, which makes sense given the vast stretches of remote old-growth forest. But sightings aren't limited to that region. The Great Lakes states, particularly Michigan and Wisconsin, have substantial numbers of reports. The Appalachian Mountains, running from Georgia all the way to Maine, form another hotspot. Even states you wouldn't necessarily associate with Bigfoot, places like Oklahoma, Texas, and Florida, have documented sightings. What's interesting about this distribution is that it correlates strongly with habitat that could support large mammals. These sightings occur in areas with sufficient food sources, water, and cover. They're not random. They're not evenly distributed across the country. They cluster in regions where if an unknown large primate did exist, it would have the resources to survive. That geographic logic adds a layer of plausibility to the reports. There's also consistency in the behavioral descriptions. Witnesses repeatedly report similar patterns. The creatures are most often seen at dawn or dusk during twilight hours when many large mammals are most active. They're frequently described as moving quickly away from humans, suggesting they actively avoid contact. They're often seen near water sources, streams, rivers, and lakes. And in many cases, witnesses report a strong, unpleasant odor, sometimes described as a mix of skunk and wet dog, sometimes as rotting garbage. These consistent behavioral and sensory details across unrelated reports suggest witnesses are describing encounters with something real, not fabricating stories from imagination. The reluctance of witnesses to come forward deserves more attention. We live in a culture where reporting a Bigfoot sighting can seriously damage your credibility. Police officers have lost promotions, teachers have been mocked by colleagues, scientists have seen their research funding dry up after mentioning an encounter. The social cost is real and significant, so when someone comes forward anyway, when they're willing to accept that cost in order to report what they saw, that reluctance itself becomes a form of evidence for their sincerity. Researcher Alex Petikoff has noted another interesting pattern in witness psychology. Many people who report sightings have detailed specific memories of the encounter but struggle to reconcile what they saw with their understanding of reality. They'll say things like, I know what I saw, but I don't know what I saw. That cognitive dissonance, that inability to integrate the experience into their worldview, is characteristic of people who've genuinely encountered something that challenges their assumptions. It's very different from how hoaxers or attention seekers typically present their stories. If eyewitness testimony is the backbone of Bigfoot evidence, footprints are the skeleton. Researchers have documented and cast more than 1,500 individual footprints over the past several decades. These prints range from 15 to 24 inches in length, with widths up to 10 inches. Some show stride lengths exceeding 50 inches, far beyond normal human capability. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some of these footprints show details that skeptics struggle to explain away. Enter Jimmy Chilcutt. Chilcutt worked as a fingerprint technician and crime scene investigator for the Conroe Police Department in Texas. His job required meticulous attention to detail and hard-nosed judgment about evidence. He was highly regarded by FBI agents, DEA agents, and law enforcement agencies across the country. This wasn't some amateur with a hobby. This was a professional whose career depended on his ability to identify authentic evidence and spot forgeries. In the late 1990s, Chilcutt was working on a personal research project trying to determine if human fingerprints could reveal information about a person's race or gender. He speculated that studying non-human primate fingerprints might provide clues, so he assembled an extensive collection of primate prints from zoos and research facilities around the world. Gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, every known primate species. Then one day in 1998, he was barely paying attention to a television program when he heard two words that made him focus immediately. Dermal ridges. That's fingerprint terminology. Someone was talking about dermal ridges on alleged Bigfoot footprints. Chilcutt's initial reaction was skepticism. He assumed this would be easy to debunk. He contacted Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, who'd been collecting and studying alleged Bigfoot footprint casts for years. Meldrum had more than 150 casts in his laboratory. Chilcutt examined them expecting to find obvious fakes. What he found instead changed his entire perspective on the Bigfoot phenomenon. The dermal ridges in these casts didn't match anything in his extensive primate collection. They weren't human. The ridges ran lengthwise along the foot rather than across like human fingerprints. There were no whorls or swirls, the patterns that are universally present in human prints. The ridges were roughly twice as thick as human dermal ridges, suggesting skin that was substantially thicker. And the cast showed crease marks that don't appear in human footprints. One footprint in particular convinced Chilcutt that something genuinely anomalous was going on. It was found in Walla Walla, Washington in 1987. When Chilcutt analyzed this cast, he made a public statement that surprised a lot of people. It certainly wasn't human and of no known primate that I've examined. Now, skeptics immediately pointed out a valid concern. Could these dermal ridges be artifacts of the casting process? Could the way plaster settles in mud naturally create ridge-like patterns that look authentic but aren't? Matt Crowley, a former pharmacist turned artist in Seattle, conducted a series of experiments trying to replicate these patterns through the casting process alone. He worked meticulously, recreating the same environmental conditions, the same soil types, the same temperatures. His experiments showed that yes, under certain specific conditions, the casting process can create patterns that superficially resemble dermal ridges. When confronted with this research, Chilcutt acknowledged the findings. He told interviewers that field researchers need to take precautions and understand that artifacts can be created under laboratory conditions. but he maintained his position about certain casts in Meldrum's collection. The Walla Walla print, along with several others, showed anatomical details that, in his professional opinion, couldn't be explained as casting artifacts. Dr. Grover Krantz, a retired physical anthropologist from Washington State University, examined many of these same casts before his death. He focused particularly on the Bossberg footprints, a series of tracks that showed anatomical deformities. Krantz's analysis concluded that these deformities showed consistency with a living foot, adapting to injury or birth defect. His statement was direct. It would be nearly impossible for a hoaxer to fake these abnormalities so accurately. Here's the question that I can't answer for you. Is it more plausible that someone created fake Bigfoot footprints sophisticated enough to fool a professional fingerprint examiner and multiple anthropologists? Or is it more plausible that these footprints came from an unknown primate species that we haven't officially classified yet? I genuinely don't know. The evidence exists, the expert analysis exists, the debate continues. Visual footage of Bigfoot has always been controversial. Every photograph gets analyzed to death. Every video gets called a hoax or a misidentification. But thermal imaging footage presents a different kind of evidence. Thermal cameras detect heat signatures, not visible light. They show you the temperature of objects and living things, making it much harder to fake a convincing image. And over the past 2 decades, as thermal imaging technology has become more accessible to researchers, some interesting footage has emerged. One of the most analyzed pieces of thermal footage comes from Florida in 2012. Stacy Brown Sr. and his son, Stacy Brown Jr., were camping in Torreya State Park in the Florida Panhandle. This area has a long history of skunk ape sightings, Florida's regional name for Bigfoot-like creatures. The Browns weren't newcomers to this. They'd been researching in these woods for years. But what they captured that night in September 2012 gave them genuine pause. Stacy Brown Sr. was armed with a FLIR Scout thermal imager, which he was using to scan the nearby woods continuously. The camera was set to what's called black-hot polarity, meaning warm objects appear black in the viewfinder rather than white. They had set up a simple campfire and were playing loud music on a stereo, a passive approach to see what might be drawn to the activity. Every so often, they would walk down the trail without using lights, hoping to observe wildlife moving in the darkness. Stacy Brown Jr. later described what happened. We went out without any lights on that way. Maybe whatever was out there couldn't see us coming. The whole time we could hear something heavy moving through the woods. Now the crickets were horribly noisy, so whatever it was had to be big. What happened next would shock my father. He stopped in the trail and said, "Hold up." He could see something on the camera. The next thing I know, he started saying, "We gotta go," so we ran back to camp. I guess Dad took off in shock. When they reviewed the footage back at camp, they saw what had startled Brown Sr. so badly. A large bipedal figure, clearly visible in thermal, walking through the woods with a distinctive gait. The figure was massive. Subsequent analysis by researcher Cliff Barackman, who appears on the television show Finding Bigfoot, included detailed measurements and comparisons. Barackman brought James Bobo Fay, who stands 6 feet 4 inches tall, back to the exact location with the same thermal camera to create a reference. Even accounting for Bobo walking with a bent knee gait similar to the figure in the original footage, the thermal subject appeared significantly larger. More striking than the size was the movement. When Bobo tried to replicate the creature's stride, it took him 2 highly exaggerated, clumsy-looking steps to match what the thermal figure accomplished in one smooth, athletic motion. The mechanics of the movement didn't look human. The proportions didn't look human. and this was thermal footage showing a heat signature, not something that could be easily faked with a costume unless someone had constructed a thermally regulated suit that could mimic the exact heat distribution of a living creature. Now, not everyone accepts this footage as authentic. A FLIR-trained thermographer analyzed the footage and raised questions about the temperature differential between the Browns footage and the Finding Bigfoot recreation. He argued that the visual appearance should have been more similar if both were filmed under comparable conditions. Stacy Brown Jr. responded by pointing out that it had rained heavily the afternoon and day before their footage was captured, making the trees wet and cooler than they would normally be. That would wash out the thermal image, explaining the difference in appearance. Who's right? I don't know. The footage exists, the analysis exists, the debate continues. What I can tell you is that thermal imaging has become a standard tool for Bigfoot researchers, precisely because it's harder to hoax than regular photography. Organizations like the Kentucky Bigfoot Research Organization have captured their own thermal footage over the years. Charlie Raymond, who founded the KBRO in 1997, has played thermal videos at public presentations showing what he describes as two creatures moving through grass in ways that don't match deer or any known canine. The technology keeps improving. Matt Moneymaker, founder of the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization and host of Finding Bigfoot, has noted that thermal imagers that used to cost over $4,000 and didn't have built-in recorders are now available as smartphone attachments. The FLIR One, for example, turns any smartphone into a thermal camera. As Moneymaker says, "If your business like mine is to go out in the woods at night, you shouldn't go out without a thermal imager. Thermal imaging allows you to see the world in terms of heat, which means you can see a rat in a tree at 100 yards. So we have this emerging body of thermal footage. Some of it's ambiguous, some of it's been debunked as bears or other wildlife, some of it remains unexplained. Does thermal imaging prove Bigfoot exists? No. But it adds another layer to the evidence pile, another category of data that researchers can analyze and debate. The advantage of thermal imaging for Bigfoot research goes beyond just being harder to fake. Thermal cameras reveal details about an animal's behavior and physiology that aren't visible in regular photography. They show heat distribution across the body, which can indicate muscle mass and activity. They reveal breathing patterns through temperature changes around the nose and mouth. They show whether a figure is generating its own body heat or is just a cold object being carried by someone. This is why FLIR Systems, one of the leading manufacturers of thermal imaging equipment, has gotten involved with Bigfoot research. Their technology has been used extensively on the Finding Bigfoot television show, and they've provided advanced equipment for specific expeditions. The company's public relations manager actually participated in filming an episode, helping to operate their Renegade mobile unit, a thermal imaging command center on wheels that features high-resolution cooled security cameras capable of detecting man-sized objects up to 2 kilometers away. During that expedition, the FLIR representative had his own experience. He was out in the woods with Cliff Barackman doing wood knocks, a technique where researchers strike trees with large sticks to potentially elicit responses from Bigfoot. After doing several knocks and hearing what sounded like a response, a loud crack came from the forest nearby. The representative immediately raised his thermal imager but couldn't see anything in the thick forest. The sound had been close and loud, suggesting something large moving, but there was no heat signature visible. According to Barackman, the sound was a classic Sasquatch response to wood knocking. But without visual confirmation, it remained just an intriguing audio event. The evolution of thermal technology has democratized Bigfoot research in interesting ways. When thermal imagers first hit the market about 2 decades ago, they cost upward of $4,000 and didn't include built-in recording capability. Now, as Matt Moneymaker points out, devices like the Flyer 1 can turn any smartphone into a thermal camera for a fraction of that cost. This accessibility means more researchers can afford the equipment, which means more potential documentation of encounters. But it also means more thermal footage that needs to be carefully analyzed to separate authentic anomalies from misidentifications. The Kentucky Bigfoot Research Organization has made thermal imaging a standard part of their field investigations. Founder Charlie Raymond has collected thermal footage over years of research in Kentucky's forests. While he's never seen a Bigfoot in person, he believes he's been close to them during expeditions based on thermal signatures and other evidence. The footage he's presented at public events typically shows distant heat signatures moving through vegetation in ways that he argues don't match deer or other known animals in the area. But thermal imaging has limitations that researchers need to acknowledge. Environmental conditions significantly affect thermal camera performance. Rain washes out images because wet surfaces all equilibrate to similar temperatures. Dense vegetation blocks heat signatures. Distance degrades image quality. And many animals, including bears, show thermal signatures that can be confused for something bipedal when viewed from certain angles. The technology is a tool, not a magic solution that definitively identifies unknown creatures. What thermal imaging does provide is another data stream. When combined with audio recordings, visual sightings, and physical evidence like footprints, thermal footage can help build a more complete picture of what's happening during an encounter. It's one piece of a larger puzzle, valuable not because it proves anything on its own, but because it adds objective measurement to subjective experience. On September 22, 2000, a group of researchers from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization was conducting an expedition in the Skookum Meadows area of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington state. They were being filmed for the television show Animal X. The team had set up what they called a fruit trap, placing apples and other fruit near a muddy area overnight, hoping to lure a Sasquatch into leaving behind evidence. The next morning, they discovered something they weren't expecting, not footprints, an entire body impression in the mud, a massive imprint that appeared to show where a large animal had laid down on its side to reach for the fruit without stepping into the mud. The impression showed what looked like the outline of a forearm, a thigh, buttocks, an Achilles tendon, and a heel. The researchers immediately recognized they might have found something significant. They used over 200 pounds of plaster and tent poles to create a detailed cast of the entire impression. The resulting artifact, which became known as the Skookum cast, weighs approximately 400 pounds and measures roughly 3.5 by 5 feet. It's one of the largest pieces of alleged Bigfoot evidence ever collected. And it sparked a debate that continues more than 2 decades later. The investigating team included some heavy hitters in Bigfoot research, Dr. Jeff Meldrum from Idaho State University, Dr. Grover Krantz from Washington State University, Dr. John Bindernagel, a Canadian wildlife biologist, John Green, a retired journalist and author who had been researching Bigfoot since the 1950s, Dr. Ron Brown, an exotic animal handler. All of them examined the cast carefully. Their conclusion? The impression couldn't be attributed to any commonly known animal in the Pacific Northwest. Meldrum focused on anatomical features he believed represented an 8 to 9 foot tall bipedal creature. The cast showed what appeared to be dermatoglyphs, the scientific term for the ridge patterns we commonly call fingerprints, which only primates are known to have. He described seeing evidence of an Achilles tendon and heel structure consistent with bipedal adaptation. Dr. Esteban Sarmiento, a primatologist who has studied great apes extensively, examined the cast and stated, "In my opinion, the Skookum body cast is that of an upright descendant of Gigantopithecus." Gigantopithecus was an actual species of giant ape that went extinct roughly 100,000 years ago. Sarmiento was suggesting this impression came from a surviving relative of that ancient species. Tom Powell, a science teacher from the Portland area who was on site when the cast was made, has spent years discussing this find. He considers it one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence for Bigfoot's existence. The argument is that the impression is too large and shows anatomical features too specific to be explained as a random mud formation or simple misidentification. But here's the problem: not everyone agrees. Skeptics, including some within the Bigfoot research community itself, argue that the cast is nothing more than an elk wallow. Elk commonly roll in mud to cool off or mark territory. They point out that elk hair was found in the mud sample. They note that the area where the impression was found is known to have a healthy elk population. And when independent analysts examined the cast, some concluded that features proponents identify as a Sasquatch heel or forearm could just as easily be explained as an elk's flank or foreleg. Blake Smith, who co-hosts the Monster Talk podcast, wrote a detailed analysis for Skeptoid in 2014. He concluded that the BFRO team was under significant pressure to produce evidence for the Animal X television crew, and that this pressure could have led to confirmation bias. They saw what they wanted to see. Smith also noted methodological concerns. The research team was close enough to the site to potentially disturb the impression before it was fully examined, and there were no baseline controls to account for prior animal activity in the wallow. So who's right? Is the Skookum cast evidence of an unknown primate or just an elk that rolled around in the mud? I honestly can't tell you. The cast exists. It's stored in Dr. Meldrum's laboratory at Idaho State University, where anyone can examine it. Multiple experts have analyzed it and reached different conclusions. Some see clear anatomical features that don't match known animals. Others see features that perfectly match elk behavior. What I can say is this: the Skookum cast represents the kind of evidence that keeps this mystery alive. It's tangible. It's been studied by credentialed scientists. It's generated peer discussion and analysis. But it hasn't provided definitive proof one way or the other. It remains in that frustrating gray area where interpretation depends heavily on what you expect to see. Bigfoot isn't exclusively a North American phenomenon. Similar creatures are reported across the globe, known by different names in different cultures. The Yeti in the Himalayas, the Yowie in Australia, the Almas in Mongolia. But one of the most compelling international cases comes from the dense rainforests of Sumatra, Indonesia, where locals speak of the orang pendek, which translates literally as short person. Unlike Bigfoot, which is typically described as 7 to 10 feet tall, the orang pendek is said to stand only 2.5 to 5 feet in height. But what it lacks in size, it apparently makes up for in strength and agility. Witnesses consistently describe a creature with massive shoulders, powerful arms, and a barrel chest. It walks upright on 2 legs. Its hair ranges from golden brown to black. And crucially, it inhabits an area of Sumatra where orangutans, the only great apes native to the region, don't live. The earliest written accounts of the orang pendek date back to Dutch colonists in the late 1800s. In 1923, a Dutch colonist named J. van Herwaarden provided one of the most detailed historical descriptions. He was hunting in the South Sumatran forest when he spotted a dark-haired creature on a tree branch. He watched it for several minutes. His description is striking because of what it doesn't say. He noted that there was nothing repulsive or ugly about its face, nor was it at all ape-like. He described very dark hair falling to just below the shoulder blades, and he estimated that if the creature had been standing, its arms would have reached to a little above its knees. Fast forward to the 1990s. Debbie Martyr, a British journalist, traveled to Sumatra in 1989 to write a travel piece. She had heard of the orang pendek and assumed it was just local folklore, a bit of color to add to her article. But then people she interviewed, people who had no reason to lie to a foreign journalist, told her they had seen this creature, not decades ago, recently, and they described it with specific, consistent details. Martyr's skepticism began to crack. 4 months after arriving in the mountains near Mount Kerinci in September 1989, she saw her first orang pendek herself. She described the experience in interviews years later. "I had a camera in my hand, but I froze because I didn't know what I was seeing." She saw it again about 3 weeks later, and over the next 15 years, Martyr saw the creature on multiple occasions. What makes Martyr's account particularly interesting is her background and what happened after those sightings. She wasn't a cryptozoologist or a Bigfoot enthusiast. She was a trained journalist, someone whose profession required skepticism and fact-checking. After her sightings, she didn't write a sensational book and leave. Instead, she stayed in Sumatra. She became head of the tiger conservation team for Kerinci Seblat National Park, the largest protected area on the island. She spent 15 years systematically documenting eyewitness accounts, working with local wildlife authorities and attempting to gather physical evidence. During those 15 years, Martyr interviewed hundreds of witnesses. She worked alongside another researcher, Jeremy Holden, a British wildlife photographer. Together, they collected footprint casts. These prints showed some fascinating features. They displayed a divergent big toe, separated from the other toes like a thumb is from fingers, similar to what you'd see in monkeys. But the toes themselves were short and wide like human toes, not long like monkey toes. The casts showed clear pressure ridges and weight distribution patterns that experts argued would be extremely difficult to fake. Another researcher, Adam Davies, made his own plaster cast of what he believed was an orang pendek footprint in the jungles of western Sumatra. His cast showed the same divergent toe structure. Richard Freeman from the Center for Fortean Zoology has spent years investigating in the same region and has photographed up to 60 species that have never been documented before. As Freeman points out, if an area can harbor dozens of unknown species, the possibility of an unknown primate isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. Here's why the orang pendek is relevant to the Bigfoot question. It shows that the phenomenon of reported unknown primates isn't culturally specific to North America. The reports are global. The descriptions are consistent within each region. And in the case of Sumatra, the creature being described is small enough and lives in dense enough jungle that its continued existence without official documentation becomes more plausible than it would be for a 10-foot-tall creature in North American forests. Some researchers speculate that the orang pendek might be a surviving population of Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species discovered on nearby Flores Island in 2003. These ancient hominins were small, upright, tool-using, and remarkably robust. If they survived on Flores until relatively recently, the idea of a related species surviving in Sumatra's isolated forests isn't impossible. Does the orang pendek exist? I can't answer that. What I can tell you is that credible researchers with scientific backgrounds have dedicated years to studying this phenomenon. They've collected physical evidence. They've documented consistent eyewitness testimony across generations. They've seen the creature themselves, and still, no definitive proof has emerged. No body, no clear photograph, just enough evidence to keep the question alive. Some of the most intriguing and unsettling Bigfoot evidence doesn't come from footprints or photographs. It comes from audio recordings captured in remote areas of North America, featuring vocalizations that experts have struggled to explain. These aren't recordings of familiar forest sounds, they're something else entirely. The most famous example is the Sierra sounds recorded by Ron Moorhead and Al Berry in the 1970s in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California.
For night view.
These recordings feature an array of vocalizations, guttural growls, whoops, and what some experts believe are linguistic patterns resembling actual language. The sounds have a tonal quality and structure that doesn't match any known animal in North America. In the early 2000s, these recordings came to the attention of Scott Nelson, a retired U.S. Navy cryptolinguist. Nelson's job in the Navy had been to analyze foreign language communications, identifying patterns, structures, and linguistic elements in recorded speech. He applied the same analytical framework to the Sierra sounds that he would use to analyze an unknown human language. His conclusion was striking. Nelson stated, "The vocalizations have all the hallmarks of a language: phones, syntax, and structure. These aren't random sounds, and they're beyond the capabilities of humans to replicate unaided." He identified what appeared to be distinct phonemes, the basic units of sound in language. He noted syntactic patterns that suggested organized communication, and he emphasized that the frequency range and depth of the sounds exceeded human vocal capability. Dr. Lynn Rogers, a wildlife biologist who has studied animal vocalizations for decades, analyzed the same recordings. His assessment: the calls have an incredible range of pitch and frequency that don't match any known species, nor can they be attributed to a hoax. It's unlike anything I've studied in the wild. Now, before we get carried away, we need to acknowledge something important. Acoustic analysis can only tell you so much. It can tell you that sounds have complexity, it can identify patterns, it can measure frequency ranges. What it can't do is definitively prove what made those sounds. Could these recordings be elaborate hoaxes? Could they be misidentified animal vocalizations combined with audio distortion? Could they be the result of multiple animals vocalizing simultaneously in ways that create the illusion of structure? Maybe. I don't know. What I can tell you is that credentialed experts who analyze sound for a living have examined these recordings and found them anomalous. That doesn't prove Bigfoot exists, but it adds another piece to the puzzle. Then there's the Ohio Howl, captured in 1994 by Matt Moneymaker, founder of the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. This recording features a long, siren-like wail that doesn't match the calls of wolves, coyotes, or any other known predator in the region. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who has analyzed numerous audio recordings, stated, "The Ohio Howl doesn't match the calls of wolves, coyotes, or any other known predator in the region. Its tonal quality and sheer power suggest an animal with exceptional lung capacity, something far larger than a human." Animal behaviorist David Ellis, who has studied the recording, observed, "The Ohio Howl is consistent with other suspected Sasquatch vocalizations. The patterns and intervals between the sounds suggest intentional communication rather than random noise." Beyond these famous examples, researchers continue to collect audio recordings from the field. A 2016 recording from Oregon features loud, echoing whoops followed by wood knocks, a behavior frequently associated with alleged Bigfoot communication. Sound technician Chris Spencer analyzed this and other recordings and noted, "What stands out is the dynamic range and power of these vocalizations. They exceed what any known animal in these areas can produce, and their repetitive nature suggests an intentional attempt to communicate." So what do we make of this audio evidence? If these sounds aren't human and they aren't from any known animal, what are we hearing? The honest answer is we don't know. The recordings exist, the expert analysis exists, but without a visual confirmation of what's making these sounds, we're left with compelling audio that raises more questions than it answers. The Bigfoot phenomenon isn't new. It's not a modern invention or a product of 1960s pop culture. For centuries, Native American tribes across North America have told stories of large, hairy, human-like creatures that inhabit the forests and mountains. Known by different names in different tribal languages, Sasquatch in Salish, Oma in Shoshone, Siatik in Lumi, these beings are deeply woven into indigenous oral traditions. What's striking about these accounts is how they differ from modern Bigfoot lore. In many tribal traditions, these creatures aren't monsters or mysterious animals. They're described as people. Another tribe, another group that lives according to different rules, but possesses intelligence, culture, and social structures. They're spoken of with respect, sometimes with caution, but not typically with fear. Chief Dan George, a famous Canadian Indigenous leader, spoke about these creatures as part of his people's oral tradition. He shared, "The Sasquatch is not a myth to us. It is part of our history, as real as the bear or the eagle. Our ancestors have seen them, and some still do. These beings are part of the land." A Northern Cheyenne elder recounted a personal encounter. "I saw it with my own eyes, tall, covered in hair, moving with a grace that no man has. We've always known they're out there. They are our brothers of the forest, ancient, wise, but they keep to their own path." For many indigenous communities, Sasquatch represents more than just a creature. It's a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the land. These traditions are passed down through generations in stories, ceremonies, and artwork. Tribal elders don't speak of these beings as cryptids or mysteries. They speak of them as inhabitants of the forest who have always been there, who prefer to avoid human contact, who live their lives parallel to but separate from human civilization. Historical records from European settlers support these accounts. Journals and letters from the 1800s include references to indigenous people speaking of hairy giants in the mountains. One particularly detailed account from a rancher in Northern California describes Native Americans bringing food to a creature living in nearby cliffs, treating it with respect and care. When the rancher asked elders about it, he was told the creature was a kind of person, different from them but deserving of consideration and protection. This indigenous perspective raises an interesting question. What if researchers have been approaching this the wrong way? What if treating Bigfoot as an undiscovered ape species is fundamentally misunderstanding what these creatures are? The tribal account suggests something more complex, beings with language, culture, social organization. Not animals in the traditional sense, but people who exist outside the framework of modern human civilization. Does this prove anything? No. But it provides historical context that extends the Bigfoot phenomenon far beyond modern sightings. These reports aren't coming from people influenced by movies or television shows. They're coming from cultural traditions that existed long before the term Bigfoot was coined. That continuity of description across centuries is hard to dismiss. This is where the Bigfoot story takes a darker turn, because alongside all the evidence that's been documented and made public, there are persistent claims that much more evidence exists but has been deliberately hidden. Former park rangers, retired law enforcement officers, and government employees have come forward over the years with remarkably consistent stories. Official agencies know more than they're admitting. Retired park ranger Bill Lansford has stated publicly, "Many of us had sightings or found tracks, but the official stance was silence. I got the message like everyone else. Bigfoot sightings aren't to be shared." Think about that for a moment. Park rangers, people who work in the wilderness every single day, who know the difference between a bear and something else, being told explicitly not to acknowledge Bigfoot encounters. Why? Former forest ranger Charles E. Howard shared a similar account. "We'd hear strange calls in the woods, sightings now and then, but we weren't supposed to acknowledge it. Orders came down to keep quiet. People wouldn't be ready to hear it." Again, we're not talking about casual hikers or amateur enthusiasts. These are professionals whose job is to monitor and protect public lands, and they're being instructed to suppress information about something they're encountering in the field. David Paulides, a former law enforcement officer who has spent years investigating Bigfoot and mysterious disappearances in national parks, has stated, "In all my years in law enforcement, I came across enough evidence to know Bigfoot was real. Yet I was told directly by superiors to leave it alone, keep it quiet. These are things the public isn't supposed to know." Retired police officer Robert Morgan added, "I knew people in my department who'd seen Bigfoot, but they were afraid to speak. Careers, reputations, everything was on the line. People have been told to stay quiet." James Bobo Fay, who appears on Finding Bigfoot, has echoed this sentiment. "I've talked to dozens of retired park rangers and cops who have seen Bigfoot but were told to drop it to avoid panic. It's part of the job," they say. Now, before we put on our tin foil hats, let's think about this rationally. Why would government agencies suppress Bigfoot evidence? What's the motivation? Several theories exist, and honestly, none of them require massive conspiracy or malicious intent. Theory 1, they genuinely don't know what these things are and don't want to create public panic about an unexplained phenomenon. It's easier to dismiss reports than to admit that something large and unknown is living in national parks and forests that millions of people visit every year. Theory 2, they're concerned about economic impact. If people became genuinely afraid to visit national parks because of confirmed reports of unknown creatures, tourism revenue would plummet. Entire communities that depend on outdoor recreation would suffer. Theory 3, they're worried about legal and bureaucratic complications. If Bigfoot is confirmed as a real species, what does that mean for logging operations, development projects, and land management? Would they need to be protected under endangered species laws? Would vast areas of forest need to be declared off-limits? Or Theory 4, there's nothing to suppress. These rangers and officers are misinterpreting what they saw, or they're exaggerating relatively minor policies about how to handle unusual wildlife reports. Maybe the truth is much more boring than a cover-up. I don't know which explanation is correct. What I do know is that Freedom of Information requests have revealed that official agencies do have documented encounters in their archives. Reports exist. Rangers have been debriefed about sightings. Documentation is there. But it's not being made public in any systematic way. That much is verifiable fact. Does this prove a cover-up? No. Does it suggest that official agencies know more than they're saying? Maybe. At minimum, it indicates that the official position, "there's nothing unusual in our forests," doesn't match what's been documented internally. And that gap between private knowledge and public statements is worth questioning. So where does that leave us? We've examined eyewitness accounts from credible professionals who risk ridicule by coming forward. We've looked at footprints with dermal ridges that a forensic fingerprint expert says don't match any known primate. We've seen thermal imaging footage showing figures that move in ways no human can replicate. We've analyzed a massive body impression that primatologists argue came from an unknown species. We've considered reports from Sumatra where researchers have dedicated decades to documenting a similar creature. We've heard audio recordings that military cryptolinguists say demonstrate language structure. We've learned about Native American traditions stretching back centuries. And we've confronted claims that government agencies know more than they're admitting. That's a lot of evidence, more than most people realize exists. But here's the frustrating truth: none of it is definitive. Every piece of evidence has alternative explanations. Every expert who says it's real has another expert who says it's not. Every compelling account has skeptics who point out methodological flaws or the possibility of hoax. So what do I think? Honestly, I think the question is still open. I think there's enough evidence to warrant serious scientific investigation. I think dismissing all of it as hoaxes and misidentifications requires assuming an extraordinary level of incompetence and dishonesty from a lot of credentialed professionals. But I also think claiming definitive proof exists is premature and intellectually dishonest. What I'm certain of is this: something is generating consistent reports across decades and continents. Whether that something is an undiscovered primate species, a surviving relic population of an ancient hominid, or just really persistent misidentification of known animals, I genuinely don't know. But the pattern is real, the evidence exists, and the mystery endures. Maybe that's okay, maybe not. Everything needs to be definitively answered. Maybe living in a world where vast forests still hold genuine mysteries is better than having every question resolved and cataloged. Or maybe I'm romanticizing an enigma that will eventually be solved with a clear photograph or a body that settles the debate once and for all. But here's something worth considering. What would definitive proof actually look like? A body? That seems like the gold standard. But even a body raises questions. How do you verify it wasn't an elaborate hoax? What DNA testing would be required? Which scientific institutions would have the courage to examine it and publish findings knowing the professional backlash they might face? The bar for proof isn't just high, it's complicated by the stigma attached to the entire topic. Clear photographic or video evidence? We already have the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967, which many experts still can't explain as a hoax despite decades of analysis. We have the Stacy Brown thermal footage. We have hundreds of other photos and videos. And yet the debate continues. Why? Because without a verifiable specimen, photographs will always be questioned. The technology to create convincing fake footage keeps improving, which paradoxically makes any new visual evidence harder to accept as authentic. DNA evidence? We already have hair samples and alleged tissue samples that don't match known species. But those results get challenged on methodological grounds, on concerns about contamination, on questions about chain of custody. The scientific establishment has enormous inertia. Accepting Bigfoot's existence would require rewriting textbooks, rethinking biogeography, and acknowledging that a massive oversight has persisted for centuries. That's a high institutional cost. So perhaps the real question isn't whether the evidence is sufficient. Perhaps the question is what level of evidence would actually convince the scientific mainstream, and whether that level is even achievable given the apparent behavior of these creatures. If they're as intelligent and elusive as witnesses suggest, if they actively avoid humans and potentially recognize cameras and research equipment, then traditional wildlife documentation methods might be fundamentally inadequate. There's also the question of what we want to be true. Some people desperately want Bigfoot to exist because it represents wilderness, mystery, and the humbling possibility that we haven't cataloged everything yet. Other people desperately want Bigfoot not to exist because its existence would challenge their understanding of biology and evolution. Both positions involve emotional investment that makes objective evaluation difficult. I find myself somewhere in the middle. I'm fascinated by the evidence. I think the consistency of reports across cultures and centuries suggests something worth investigating. I believe many witnesses are sincere and credible, but I also recognize my own bias toward wanting mystery to exist in the world. I can't claim pure objectivity any more than the true believers or the hardcore skeptics can. What I can say with confidence is that the Bigfoot phenomenon, whether it represents an unknown species or a persistent cultural myth, tells us something important about human nature. It tells us that we still crave mystery. We still want to believe that wilderness holds secrets. We're still capable of wonder in an age where satellite imagery has mapped every square meter of the planet's surface. That desire for the unknown, for the possibility that something large and intelligent could exist without our permission or knowledge, says something profound about who we are as a species. The indigenous perspectives on this phenomenon deserve more weight than they typically receive. Native American tribes didn't develop elaborate traditions about forest people for entertainment. These traditions serve purposes, encoded knowledge, guided behavior. When tribal elders say these beings are real and have always been part of the landscape, dismissing those statements as primitive superstition feels both arrogant and short-sighted. Maybe, just maybe, the people who've lived in these forests for thousands of years have knowledge that modern science hasn't yet acquired. And finally, there's the question of consequence. What happens if Bigfoot is definitively proven to exist tomorrow? Does our relationship with wilderness change? Do we suddenly treat forests with more respect, knowing they harbor intelligent beings? Or do we descend on these areas with research teams and camera crews, destroying the habitat and driving these creatures to extinction within a generation? Sometimes I wonder if the mystery serves a protective function. If these beings exist and have survived this long, perhaps it's because they remain officially unconfirmed. What I will say is this: if you've made it this far, you've seen evidence that most people never encounter. You've heard from experts who've spent careers analyzing this phenomenon. You've considered perspectives from indigenous traditions to modern thermal imaging technology. Whether that evidence convinces you or leaves you skeptical is entirely up to you. For me, the Bigfoot question remains one of the most intriguing unsolved mysteries in natural history. Not because I'm desperate to believe, but because the evidence suggests there's something out there that we haven't fully explained yet. And in a world where we think we've cataloged and categorized everything, that possibility is genuinely exciting. So what do you think? Is the evidence convincing enough to suggest something unknown is out there? Or does it all boil down to misidentification and wishful thinking? I'd genuinely love to know, because at the end of the day, this mystery belongs to all of us. The forests are there, the reports continue, and the question remains unanswered. Maybe that's exactly how it should be. For more interesting stories, check this out.